My name is Brian Carson, and for 5 years I've been diving the kelp forests and deep reefs off the California coast, collecting data for my marine biology doctoral research at UC San Diego. I've logged over 400 dives in some of the most challenging underwater environments on the West Coast, earned advanced technical diving certifications, and built a reputation for being able to work effectively at depths that challenge even experienced divers. But nothing in 5 years of research diving prepared me for what happened on October 14th, when my life support systems failed at 120 feet and a stranger appeared from the depths to save my life in ways I'm still trying to understand. The dive was part of my dissertation research on deep water coral ecosystems along the continental shelf edge, about 12 miles southwest of La Jolla. I was working with Dr. Sarah Mitchell's research team from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, documenting coral communities that existed in the twilight zone between 100 and 150 feet depth. My dive team consisted of 3 experienced researchers: Dr. Mitchell herself, a 45-year-old marine ecologist who'd been diving these waters for over 20 years, Jake Rodriguez, a 32-year-old dive safety officer whose job was to ensure that our research operations remained within safe parameters, and myself, the graduate student whose dissertation depended on collecting detailed photographic and water quality data from these deep coral communities. We were diving from the research vessel Challenger, a 65-foot research vessel equipped with mixed gas diving systems, underwater communication equipment, and all the safety gear required for scientific diving operations. The dive plan called for a maximum depth of 130 feet with a bottom time of 25 minutes, using trimix breathing gas to avoid nitrogen narcosis at depth. Conditions are perfect, Jake reported as we completed our pre-dive safety briefing. Visibility is over 80 feet, current is minimal, and the water temperature is stable at 58 degrees. We should have excellent conditions for photography and sampling. The target site was a previously unexplored section of rocky reef that sonar surveys had suggested might contain significant coral communities. My research focused on the relationship between water temperature, current patterns, and coral diversity at depths where sunlight was limited but nutrients were abundant. At 9:30 a.m., we began our descent along the anchor line, following standard procedures for deep technical diving. The visibility was exceptional, allowing us to see the bottom structure clearly from 80 feet above. The reef appeared exactly as our sonar data had predicted, a complex structure of rocky outcroppings and canyons that created ideal habitat for deep water coral communities. Visual contact with the bottom, Dr. Mitchell reported through our underwater communication system as we reached 100 feet. The coral formations look even more extensive than we expected. At 120 feet, we reached our target depth and began the research work that had brought us to this remote location. The coral communities were spectacular, massive formations of deep water species that created underwater gardens unlike anything I'd seen in shallower waters. I began photographing the coral formations while Jake collected water samples and Dr. Mitchell documented the species distribution patterns. The work was going perfectly with excellent visibility and calm conditions that allowed for detailed scientific observations. But at 11:47 a.m., exactly 17 minutes into our bottom time, my primary breathing gas regulator failed catastrophically. The failure was sudden and complete. One moment I was breathing normally from my primary regulator, and the next I was getting no gas flow at all. I immediately switched to my backup regulator, but it too was malfunctioning, providing only intermittent gas flow that wasn't sufficient to support my breathing needs at 120 feet depth. In technical diving, gas supply failure is one of the most serious emergencies you can face, especially at depth where rapid ascent can cause decompression sickness or arterial gas embolism. I had maybe 2 minutes of emergency gas remaining in my bailout bottle, not enough to reach the surface safely from 120 feet. I signaled to Jake and Dr. Mitchell, using the standard emergency signals for gas supply failure. Jake immediately began moving toward me with his emergency gas sharing equipment, but he was about 50 feet away, working in a different section of the reef. The physiology of gas supply failure at depth is unforgiving. At 120 feet, the increased ambient pressure means your body consumes breathing gas 4 times faster than at the surface. Without adequate gas flow, you have maybe 30 to 45 seconds before CO2 buildup begins affecting your cognitive function and decision-making ability. I began swimming toward Jake, but the combination of gas supply failure and increasing CO2 levels was already affecting my coordination and judgment. The emergency gas in my bailout bottle was running out faster than I'd calculated, and I realized that Jake might not reach me in time to prevent a fatal out-of-gas emergency. That's when I saw him. A diver appeared from a canyon in the reef structure about 30 feet below our work site, swimming upward with the powerful, efficient movements of someone who was completely comfortable at depth. He was wearing technical diving gear similar to ours, but his equipment configuration was different, more streamlined and professional than typical research diving gear. The diver reached me before Jake could cover the distance between us, immediately recognizing my emergency situation and responding with procedures that indicated extensive technical diving training. Without hesitation, he deployed his emergency gas-sharing equipment and provided me with a reliable source of breathing gas. "Breathe slow and steady," I heard through my underwater communication system, though the voice wasn't familiar and didn't belong to anyone from our research team. The relief of having adequate breathing gas was immediate, but it also raised questions about who this diver was and why he was in our research area. Dr. Mitchell's dive plan hadn't included any other divers, and our research permit restricted access to the site to authorized personnel only. But emergency procedures took priority over questions about unauthorized divers. The stranger immediately began guiding me through the ascent procedures necessary to reach the surface safely from 120 feet, sharing his gas supply while maintaining the decompression stops required to prevent diving-related injuries. "We need to make decompression stops at 80 feet, 60 feet, 40 feet, and 20 feet, the stranger communicated, demonstrating knowledge of technical diving procedures that matched or exceeded my own training. The ascent took nearly 20 minutes, during which the stranger shared his breathing gas and guided me through the precise procedures necessary to avoid decompression sickness. His calm professionalism and technical expertise made it clear that he was an extremely experienced technical diver, possibly more experienced than anyone on our research team. But when we reached our 20-foot decompression stop, something happened that I still don't understand. Jake and Dr. Mitchell had completed their own emergency ascent and were waiting for us at the 20-foot stop. But when they looked for the diver who had rescued me, he was nowhere to be seen. "Where's the other diver?" Jake asked through our communication system. "The one who was sharing gas with you?" I looked around the 20-foot stop area, but the stranger had vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared. There was no sign of him anywhere in the water column, no indication of where he'd gone or how he'd disappeared without any of us noticing. "He was right here a minute ago," I replied, confused and disoriented by his sudden disappearance. "He saved my life. He shared his gas and guided me through the entire ascent." Dr. Mitchell and Jake exchanged concerned looks, recognizing that my account of the rescue didn't match what they'd observed during the emergency ascent. "Brian, we didn't see anyone else during the ascent," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "You were breathing from Jake's emergency gas system the entire time." The statement didn't make sense with my clear memories of the rescue, but I was exhausted from the emergency and possibly suffering from mild nitrogen narcosis that could affect my perception and memory. When we finally reached the surface and were back aboard the research vessel Challenger, I tried to piece together what had actually happened during my equipment failure and emergency ascent. But the more I thought about it, the more confused I became about the identity of the diver who had appeared from nowhere to save my life. The equipment failure investigation revealed that my primary regulator had suffered a catastrophic internal failure that should have been impossible with properly maintained gear. The backup regulator failure was even more puzzling, a simultaneous malfunction that created exactly the kind of life-threatening emergency that technical divers train to avoid. But the most puzzling aspect was the identity of my rescuer, the diver who had appeared from the depths and disappeared just as mysteriously after ensuring my safe return to the surface. Over the next several days, I tried to find any information about other divers who might have been in our research area on October 14th. I contacted dive shops, research institutions, and technical diving organizations throughout Southern California, but no one had any record of authorized diving activities in our location. The mystery of my underwater rescuer would become an obsession that would drive me to return to those same waters again and again, searching for answers about what had really happened at 120 feet and trying to find the stranger who had saved my life when my equipment failed and death seemed certain. But I would never see him again, and I would never get the chance to tell him what his appearance in my moment of greatest need had meant to me. The weeks following my rescue were filled with medical evaluations, equipment investigations, and attempts to understand what had actually happened during those critical moments at 120 feet. The incident had shaken everyone involved in the research project, raising questions about dive safety procedures and the reliability of technical diving equipment. Dr. Mitchell arranged for a comprehensive medical examination to ensure I hadn't suffered any diving-related injuries from the rapid ascent or prolonged exposure to elevated CO2 levels. The results were reassuring: no signs of decompression sickness, arterial gas embolism, or other physiological damage from the emergency. You were extremely fortunate. Dr. Patricia Williams, the diving medicine specialist who conducted my evaluation, explained. Equipment failures of the type you experienced have resulted in fatalities in similar situations. The fact that you received immediate gas sharing probably saved your life. But the equipment investigation raised more questions than it answered. My primary regulator had suffered what the manufacturer described as an impossible failure, a simultaneous malfunction of multiple redundant safety systems that should have prevented any interruption of gas flow. We've never seen a failure pattern like this, explained Tom Rodriguez, the technical diving equipment specialist who examined my gear. The primary regulator suffered catastrophic internal damage, but the backup regulator also failed in a completely different way. The probability of both systems failing simultaneously is essentially zero. The statistical impossibility of the equipment failures added another layer of mystery to an incident that already defied easy explanation. Either I'd experienced a 1 in a million mechanical failure, or there were factors involved that weren't apparent from the physical evidence. But the most persistent mystery remained the identity of my rescuer. Despite extensive efforts to identify other divers who might have been in the area, no one could provide any information about the diver who had appeared from nowhere to save my life. Are you certain there was another diver? Jake asked during one of our debriefing sessions. Emergency situations can sometimes create false memories or hallucinations, especially when CO2 levels are elevated. The suggestion that I might have imagined my rescuer was disturbing, but I had to consider the possibility that psychological factors could have affected my perception of events during the emergency. The memories are very clear, I replied. I remember his equipment configuration, his communication style, and the specific procedures he used during the ascent. It doesn't feel like a hallucination or false memory. Dr. Mitchell, who had extensive experience with diving emergencies, offered a different perspective on what might have happened. It's possible that there was another diver in the area who provided assistance and then left before we could identify him, she suggested. Unauthorized diving in research areas isn't common, but it's not impossible. The theory made sense from a logical standpoint, but it didn't explain how the mysterious diver had disappeared so completely after ensuring my safety. Technical divers operating at 120 feet don't simply vanish without leaving some trace of their presence. I began conducting my own investigation into the incident, starting with a systematic review of all diving activities in the area during the time period when my rescue occurred. The effort involved contacting every dive shop, research institution, and technical diving organization within a 100-mile radius of our dive site. We don't have any record of authorized diving in that area on October 14th, confirmed Captain Steve Martinez of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which monitors diving activities in protected marine areas. Your research team had the only permit for that location. Similar responses came from the Coast Guard, the National Marine Sanctuary Office, and every other agency that might have knowledge of diving activities in the area. According to all official records, my research team had been the only divers authorized to be in that location. The investigation expanded to include commercial diving operations, underwater photography expeditions, and private technical diving activities that might not have required official permits. But weeks of searching produced no leads about the identity of my mysterious rescuer. Maybe he was a military diver, suggested Lisa Thompson, a technical diving instructor who had experience with Navy diving operations. Military divers sometimes conduct training exercises in areas where civilian diving is also taking place. I contacted the Naval Special Warfare Command and other military diving units that might have been operating in the area, but they had no record of any training exercises or operations near our research site on October 14th. The lack of any official record of other diving activities forced me to consider more unusual explanations for what I'd experienced. Perhaps my rescuer had been conducting unauthorized research, illegal salvage operations, or some other activity that wouldn't appear in official records. But the more I investigated, the more convinced I became that the diver who had saved my life wasn't engaged in any conventional diving activity. His equipment, his techniques, and his immediate response to my emergency suggested a level of expertise and preparation that went beyond normal technical diving operations. 3 months after the incident, I decided to return to the dive site to look for any physical evidence of my rescuer's presence. The effort required convincing Dr. Mitchell to approve another research dive to the same location, despite concerns about returning to the site of such a serious diving emergency. I need to understand what happened down there, I explained to Dr. Mitchell during our planning meeting. There are too many unanswered questions about the incident, and returning to the site might provide some answers. Dr. Mitchell was understandably cautious about approving a return to the location where I'd nearly died, but she also recognized the scientific and psychological importance of understanding the incident completely. "We'll conduct the dive with enhanced safety protocols," she decided. "Triple redundancy on all life support systems, additional safety divers, and real-time monitoring from the surface." The return dive took place on January 23rd, exactly 3 months after my original equipment failure. The conditions were similar to those during my rescue: excellent visibility, minimal current, and calm surface conditions that allowed for detailed underwater investigation. At 120 feet, I returned to the exact location where my equipment had failed and my mysterious rescuer had appeared. The coral formations were unchanged, but I was looking for any evidence that might explain who had been in the area or why they had disappeared so completely after ensuring my safety. "Look for anything unusual," I told Jake and Dr. Mitchell as we began our systematic search of the area. "Equipment, marking, anything that might indicate another diver had been working in this area." The search continued for the full 25 minutes of our bottom time, covering every section of reef where my rescuer might have been positioned before appearing to help me. But we found no evidence of any diving activity beyond our own research operations. No lost equipment, no survey markers, no tool marks on the reef structure. Nothing that would indicate another diver had been working in the area before, during, or after my equipment failure. "It's like he was never here," I observed as we completed our decompression stops and returned to the surface. But the absence of physical evidence didn't diminish my clear memories of the rescue or my certainty that someone had saved my life during those critical moments when my breathing gas failed and death seemed inevitable. The return dive had provided closure in some ways, but it had also deepened the mystery of my rescuer's identity and left me with more questions than answers about what had actually happened at 120 feet. Over the following months, I continued my search for information about the diver who had appeared from nowhere to save my life. The effort became an obsession that affected my graduate studies, my research work, and my personal relationships. "You need to accept that you might never know who helped you," Dr. Mitchell advised during one of our discussions about the incident. "Sometimes in life, people help us and then disappear and we never get the chance to thank them properly." But I couldn't accept that explanation. Someone had risked their own safety to ensure that I survived a potentially fatal diving emergency, and I felt a profound obligation to find them and express my gratitude for their life-saving intervention. The search would continue for years, driving me to investigate every possible lead and explore every theory about who might have been in those waters on October 14th. But I would never find any trace of my mysterious rescuer, and I would never get the chance to tell him what his appearance in my moment of greatest need had meant to me. 6 months after my rescue, the search for my mysterious savior had become the driving force in my life, overshadowing my graduate research and straining my relationships with colleagues and friends who thought I was pursuing an impossible quest. I had systematically investigated every possible explanation for the appearance of another diver at 120 feet, from military operations to illegal salvage activities to unauthorized research projects. Every lead had proven to be a dead end, but I couldn't abandon the search for someone who had risked their own life to save mine. "Brian, you need to consider the possibility that your memories of the rescue aren't accurate," Dr. Williams, the diving medicine specialist, suggested during one of my follow-up appointments. "Elevated CO2 levels and extreme stress can create very vivid false memories that feel completely real." The theory that I had imagined my rescuer was supported by several medical professionals, but it contradicted everything I remembered about those critical moments at depth. The details were too specific, too technically accurate, and too consistent with actual rescue procedures to be the product of hallucination or false memory. I remember his equipment configuration, his communication style, and the exact procedures he used during the ascent, I explained to Dr. Williams. Those aren't the kind of details that come from hallucinations. But I had to acknowledge that the complete absence of physical evidence was troubling. If my rescuer had been real, there should have been some trace of his presence. Equipment marks on the reef, gas bubbles visible to other divers, or at minimum some recognition from Jake and Dr. Mitchell that another diver had been involved in my rescue. The investigation had expanded to include private investigators, underwater search specialists, and diving historians who might have knowledge of unusual rescue incidents in California waters. But months of professional investigation had produced no leads about the identity of my mysterious savior. "I've investigated dozens of diving incidents over 30 years, explained Detective Ray Santos, a retired Los Angeles police officer who specialized in underwater accidents. In every case where someone was rescued by another diver, we were able to identify the rescuer within days. Your case is unique. The uniqueness of my situation was both frustrating and compelling. Either I had experienced something that had no precedent in diving rescue history, or I was pursuing a phantom created by my own psychological response to a near-death experience. But the search had also revealed stories of other divers who had reported similar encounters with mysterious rescuers in California waters. The accounts were scattered across decades in different locations, but they shared common elements that suggested a pattern of unexplained diving rescues. I was diving alone near Catalina Island in 1987 when my regulator failed at 80 feet, reported Tom Mitchell, a retired commercial diver I contacted through diving forums. A diver appeared from nowhere, shared gas with me, and guided me to the surface. When I looked for him after reaching the boat, he was gone. Similar stories came from divers throughout Southern California, dating back to the 1970s. The accounts described rescues by mysterious divers who appeared during emergencies, provided life-saving assistance, and then disappeared without revealing their identities. "It's like there's a guardian angel down there," observed Captain Maria Rodriguez, a dive boat operator who had heard similar stories from customers over 20 years of operation. "Divers get in trouble, someone appears to help them and then vanishes. It happens often enough that we have a name for him, the ghost diver." The idea that my rescuer might be part of a larger pattern of unexplained diving rescues was both comforting and mystifying. If other divers had experienced similar encounters, it suggested that my memories were accurate and that something extraordinary was happening in California waters. But it also raised new questions about who was conducting these rescues and why they remained hidden from official notice. The level of technical diving expertise required for deep water rescues suggested professional training and equipment that would be difficult to conceal from the diving community. I began documenting every reported encounter with the mysterious rescuer, creating a database of incidents that spanned 40 years in dozens of locations along the California coast. The pattern that emerged was remarkable in its consistency and geographical scope. The encounters always involve life-threatening emergencies, I noted during a presentation to the San Diego Underwater Explorers Club. Equipment failures, entanglement situations, lost diver scenarios, always situations where immediate expert assistance was the difference between life and death. The audience of experienced technical divers was skeptical but intrigued by the documented pattern of rescues. Several members shared their own stories of unusual encounters with helpful divers who had appeared during emergencies and then disappeared. "I was trapped in a fishing net at 90 feet near Point Loma," reported Jessica Martinez, a marine photographer with over 1,000 log dives. "A diver appeared with cutting tools and freed me from the entanglement. When I turned to thank him, he was gone." The accumulating evidence suggested that my rescue hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a long-standing pattern of mysterious interventions in diving emergencies. But it still didn't answer the fundamental questions about who was conducting these rescues or why they remained hidden. A year after my own rescue, I decided to take a more active approach to finding my mysterious savior. Instead of just investigating past incidents, I would return to the diving areas where rescues had been reported and try to observe this mysterious helper in action. The plan required hundreds of hours of diving in locations where emergencies had been reported, hoping to encounter the ghost diver during his rescue activities. It was a long shot, but it represented my best chance of finally meeting the person who had saved my life. "This is becoming an unhealthy obsession," warned my graduate advisor, Dr. Robert Thompson, when I explained my plan to spend my research time looking for mysterious rescue divers. "You need to focus on completing your dissertation, not chasing underwater phantoms." But I couldn't abandon the search. Someone had risked their own life to save mine, and I felt a moral obligation to find them and express my gratitude. More importantly, I believed that understanding the mystery might provide insights that could improve diving safety for everyone. The search would continue for 3 more years, involving hundreds of dives and thousands of hours of underwater observation. I would document dozens of additional rescue incidents and interview hundreds of divers who had experienced similar encounters. But I would never see my rescuer again, and I would never get the chance to tell him what his intervention had meant to me during those critical moments when my equipment failed and death seemed certain. The ghost diver remained a mystery, a guardian angel of the depths whose identity and motivations were known only to himself and the divers whose lives he had saved during moments when hope seemed lost and survival impossible. 3 years after my rescue, I had documented over 40 similar incidents spanning 5 decades of California diving history. The pattern was undeniable. Diverse and life-threatening emergencies were being rescued by a mysterious figure who appeared during critical moments and disappeared before his identity could be determined. My research had evolved from a personal quest to find my rescuer into a comprehensive study of unexplained diving rescues along the California coast. The database I'd created included detailed accounts from survivors, witness statements, and analysis of the technical diving procedures used during each rescue. This is remarkable work, Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, a diving accident investigator from the University of California, told me after reviewing my research. You've identified a pattern of rescues that has been operating for decades without any official recognition or investigation. The pattern revealed several consistent characteristics that distinguished these rescues from normal diving assistance. The mysterious rescuer always appeared during genuine life-threatening emergencies, demonstrated expert-level technical diving skills, and disappeared immediately after ensuring the victim's safety. The technical competency is extraordinary, noted Captain James Wilson, a retired Navy diving supervisor who reviewed my incident reports. The rescue procedures described in these accounts require years of specialized training and extensive experience with emergency diving operations. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the pattern was its geographical and temporal consistency. The mysterious rescuer had been operating in California waters since at least the 1970s, covering hundreds of miles of coastline and demonstrating a presence that seemed to encompass the entire Southern California diving community. If this is one person, he would have to be in his 70s or 80s by now, observed Dr. Martinez during our analysis of the timeline. But the recent rescues describe someone who moves and operates like a much younger diver. The age inconsistency suggested either multiple individuals operating as mystery rescuers, or factors that I hadn't yet understood about the nature of these interventions. My investigation had also revealed that the diving community had informal knowledge of the ghost diver that wasn't reflected in official records. Dive boat operators, instructors, and experienced divers often shared stories about the mysterious rescuer, but the accounts were treated as folklore rather than documented incidents. We've been hearing stories about the ghost diver for 30 years, explained Captain Sandra Rodriguez, who operated dive boats out of San Pedro. Divers get in trouble, someone helps them, and then vanishes. It happens often enough that we tell new divers about it, but nobody takes it seriously as a real phenomenon. The informal nature of the reports had prevented any systematic investigation of the rescue pattern, allowing the ghost diver to operate for decades without attracting official attention or scientific study. But my research had also revealed a troubling recent development. The frequency of mysterious rescues had been declining over the past 5 years, suggesting that the ghost diver's activities were decreasing or ending entirely. The last confirmed rescue was 8 months ago near La Jolla, I noted during a presentation to the California Association of Diving Instructors. Before that, there were regular reports every few months. Something has changed. The decline in rescue reports coincided with improvements in diving safety equipment and training that had reduced the frequency of life-threatening diving emergencies. But it also raised questions about whether the ghost diver was still active or had ended his decades-long mission for reasons I couldn't determine. 4 years after my own rescue, I received a lead that would bring me closer to understanding the mystery than any previous investigation had achieved. Margaret Thompson, an 82-year-old former dive shop owner from Santa Barbara, contacted me after hearing about my research through the diving community grapevine. She claimed to have information about the ghost diver that dated back to the early days of California sport diving. "I think I know who you're looking for," Margaret told me during our phone conversation. "But it's a story that very few people would believe, and it involves things that happened before most current divers were even born." I arranged to meet Margaret at her home in Santa Barbara, where she shared a story that provided context for the mysterious rescues but raised even more questions about the identity and motivations of my rescuer. "His name was David McKenzie," Margaret began, showing me a faded photograph of a young man in vintage diving gear. "He was one of the first technical divers in California, back in the 1960s when most people were using basic scuba gear for shallow water diving." According to Margaret's account, David McKenzie had been a pioneering figure in California technical diving, developing many of the procedures and equipment configurations that were later adopted as standard practice for deep-water diving operations. "He was obsessed with diving safety," Margaret continued. "David believed that the diving community had a responsibility to look out for each other, especially when people got in trouble beyond their experience level." The philosophy that Margaret described matched exactly with the pattern of rescues I'd documented. Interventions that occurred when divers faced life-threatening situations that exceeded their ability to handle alone. "What happened to him?" I asked, anticipating that Margaret's story would provide the missing piece of the mystery. He was killed in a diving accident in 1973, Margaret replied, showing me a newspaper clipping that reported David Mackenzie's death during a deep-water rescue attempt near Catalina Island. He died trying to save another diver who had gotten trapped in a cave system. The information was both enlightening and confusing. If David Mackenzie had died in 1973, he couldn't have been conducting rescues for the past 50 years. But Margaret's description of his philosophy and approach to diving safety matched perfectly with the pattern of mysterious rescues I'd documented. "Are you sure it was David Mackenzie who rescued you?" Margaret asked after I described my own encounter with the ghost diver. "I never learned his name," I admitted. "But the technical expertise and rescue procedures match everything you've described about David's approach to diving safety." Margaret studied the details of my rescue account with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades in the diving community and understood the technical aspects of emergency diving operations. "The equipment configuration you described, the communication style, the specific ascent procedures, they're all consistent with David's methods," she concluded. "But that's impossible because David Mackenzie has been dead for over 40 years. The conversation with Margaret provided more questions than answers, but it also gave me a specific focus for my continuing investigation. If David Mackenzie had been the original ghost diver, perhaps someone had continued his mission after his death, using his techniques and philosophy to continue the pattern of mysterious rescues. Or perhaps there were aspects of this mystery that went beyond normal explanations and into territory that I wasn't prepared to explore. But one thing was certain. My rescue at 120 feet had been part of a pattern of interventions that had been saving divers' lives for over 50 years, conducted by someone whose identity and motivations remained as mysterious as they were effective. I still didn't know who had saved my life during those critical moments when my equipment failed and death seemed inevitable. But I now understood that I had been rescued by someone whose commitment to diving safety transcended normal human limitations and whose legacy continued to protect divers long after any normal person would have ended their mission. 5 years after my rescue, I had accepted that I might never solve the mystery of the ghost diver's identity. My research had documented the pattern of rescues, connected them to David Mackenzie's legacy, and provided the diving community with awareness of a phenomenon that had been operating in secret for decades. But I had also returned to my graduate studies, completed my dissertation on deep-water coral ecosystems, and begun working as a marine biologist for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. The obsessive search for my rescuer had evolved into a professional interest in diving safety and a personal commitment to helping other divers in emergency situations. "You've become the thing you were searching for," observed Dr. Mitchell during one of our conversations about my career development. "You're using your expertise to help other divers, just like the ghost diver helped you." The observation was accurate. I had become one of California's most experienced technical diving rescue specialists, responding to diving emergencies throughout the state and training other divers in advanced rescue techniques. But the work had also provided opportunities to continue investigating the mystery that had shaped my career. In October 2019, exactly 5 years after my own rescue, I was called to respond to a diving emergency near La Jolla that would provide the final piece of the puzzle I'd been trying to solve for half a decade. A marine biology student from UC San Diego had experienced equipment failure at 110 feet while conducting research on the same reef system where I'd nearly died 5 years earlier. The parallels to my own experience were uncanny. Similar location, similar depth, similar equipment failure pattern. The victim is Lisa Martinez, 24 years old, graduate student conducting thesis research, reported Captain Steve Rodriguez as I prepared for the rescue dive. "She's been missing for over an hour, and we haven't been able to establish communication." The emergency response protocols I developed over 5 years of rescue work were based partly on my own experience of equipment failure at depth. I knew exactly what Lisa was experiencing and what procedures would be most effective for locating and assisting her. At 110 feet, I found Lisa in almost exactly the same location where my own equipment had failed 5 years earlier. She was conscious but in severe distress, having exhausted her emergency gas supply and unable to reach the surface safely without assistance. "I've got you," I communicated through our underwater system as I deployed my emergency gas sharing equipment. "We're going to get you to the surface safely." The rescue proceeded exactly as I'd been trained, using the same techniques and procedures that had been used to save my own life 5 years earlier. I shared my breathing gas with Lisa, guided her through the required decompression stops, and maintained constant communication to ensure her psychological stability during the emergency ascent. But as we reached the 20-foot decompression stop, something extraordinary happened that would finally answer the questions I'd been pursuing for 5 years. Another diver appeared from the depths below us, swimming upward with the same powerful, efficient movements I remembered from my own rescue. The equipment configuration was identical to what I'd observed 5 years earlier, and the approach to our emergency was professional and coordinated. Additional diver approaching from below, I reported to the surface support team, wanting to ensure that this encounter was documented by other witnesses. The mysterious diver reached our position and immediately began assisting with Lisa's rescue, deploying backup emergency equipment and providing redundant life support systems that ensured her complete safety during the remaining ascent. But most importantly, I was finally face to face with the person who had saved my life 5 years earlier. The diver's mask and equipment made positive identification impossible, but every detail of his movements, his equipment configuration, and his rescue procedures matched my memories of my own rescue exactly. This was definitely the same person who had appeared from nowhere to save my life in 2014. As we completed the final decompression stop and began our ascent to the surface, I tried to communicate with my mysterious rescuer, hoping to finally learn his identity and express my gratitude for his intervention 5 years earlier. "Thank you for helping," I transmitted through our underwater communication system. "You saved my life in this same location 5 years ago." The response came through clearly, but it raised more questions than it answered. "I know," the mysterious diver replied. "That's why you're here now." Before I could ask for clarification, we reached the surface and the chaos of emergency response procedures took priority over personal conversations. Lisa was quickly transferred to the Coast Guard helicopter for medical evaluation, and the surface support team began debriefing the rescue operation. But when I looked for my mysterious partner in the rescue, he had vanished once again, leaving no trace of his presence except the successful completion of another life-saving intervention. "Where's the other diver who assisted with the rescue?" Captain Rodriguez asked as we conducted the post-incident briefing. "He disappeared," I replied, recognizing that my answer would sound as impossible to others as similar reports had sounded to me 5 years earlier. But this time I had a different perspective on the mystery. Instead of being frustrated by my rescuer's disappearance, I was beginning to understand the pattern and purpose behind his interventions. The statement, "That's why you're here now," suggested that my rescue 5 years earlier had been part of a larger plan, that my survival had enabled me to become the person who could rescue Lisa and continue the cycle of life-saving interventions. Over the following weeks, I reflected on the possibility that the Ghost Diver's mission wasn't just about conducting individual rescues, but about creating a network of skilled rescue divers who could continue his work throughout the diving community. My own career development seemed to support this theory. The experience of being rescued had motivated me to become expert in technical diving rescue procedures, and I'd already saved several divers who had faced similar emergencies. Each person I'd rescued had the potential to become another link in the chain of divers committed to helping others in emergency situations. "It's like a legacy system," I explained to Dr. Mitchell during one of our discussions about diving safety. "Someone saves your life, and that motivates you to develop the skills to save others. The rescue expertise gets passed along and multiplied throughout the diving community." 6 months after Lisa's rescue, I received confirmation that my theory was correct. Lisa had used her experience to become certified as a technical diving rescue specialist and had already assisted in 2 emergency responses near San Diego. "I felt an obligation to learn rescue techniques after being saved myself," Lisa explained when I encountered her during a diving safety training course. "If someone hadn't appeared to help me, I would have died at 110 feet. Now I want to be able to do the same thing for other divers." The pattern was exactly what I'd observed in my own career development. The experience of being rescued created a powerful motivation to acquire the skills and knowledge necessary to help other divers in similar emergencies. A year after Lisa's rescue, I finally understood that my 5-year search for the ghost diver had been misdirected. The mystery wasn't about finding one specific individual, but about recognizing that I had become part of something larger. A tradition of diving safety that had been operating for decades through people like David Mackenzie and others who had committed their lives to protecting fellow divers. The ghost diver might have been David Mackenzie's spirit, or someone who had taken up his mission, or simply the collective presence of all the divers who had been inspired by rescue experiences to become rescuers themselves. The specific identity was less important than the continuation of the mission. I never did get the chance to tell my rescuer what his intervention had meant to me during those critical moments when my equipment failed and death seemed certain. But I realized that the best way to honor his sacrifice was to continue the work he had started, using the life he had saved to save other lives in return. The mystery of the ghost diver would probably never be solved completely, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was that his legacy continued through every diver who had been inspired by rescue experiences to become a rescuer, every person who had chosen to risk their own safety to help others in emergency situations. I had been saved by someone whose identity I would never know, but whose influence would continue through my own actions and the actions of every diver I would train, rescue, or inspire during the rest of my career. Sometimes the most important debts can't be repaid to the person who saved you, they can only be paid forward to the people you have the opportunity to save in return. 10 years after my rescue at 120 feet, I stood on the deck of a Coast Guard cutter, preparing to descend to 150 feet to rescue 2 recreational divers who had become trapped in an underwater cave system near Catalina Island. The emergency call had come at 2 a.m., and I was the closest qualified technical rescue diver available to respond. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to risk my life to save 2 strangers, just as someone had risked their life to save me a decade earlier. The cycle that had begun with David Mackenzie in the 1960s was continuing through my own actions and the actions of dozens of other divers who had been inspired to become rescuers. Conditions are challenging, Coast Guard rescue swimmer Maria Santos briefed me as I completed my pre-dive checks. Limited visibility, strong current, and the victims are in a confined space that complicates rescue procedures. The technical demands of the rescue were exactly the kind of challenge that required years of specialized training and extensive experience with emergency diving operations. But they were also the kind of challenges that the mysterious rescuer had been handling for decades, appearing whenever divers faced situations that exceeded their ability to survive alone. At 150 feet inside the cave system, I found the 2 recreational divers in serious trouble. They had become disoriented in the limited visibility and had consumed most of their breathing gas trying to find an exit from the underwater maze. Without immediate assistance, they would have died within minutes. "I'm here to help," I communicated through my underwater communication system as I deployed my emergency gas-sharing equipment. "We're going to get you out of here safely." The rescue required 2 hours of careful work, sharing breathing gas with both victims while navigating through the complex cave system to reach open water. The procedures I used were the same ones that had been developed by pioneers like David Mackenzie and refined through decades of rescue experience. But as we finally emerged from the cave system and began our ascent to the surface, I experienced something that connected me directly to the mystery I'd been investigating for a decade. For just a moment, I felt the presence of other divers around us, not visible to my eyes but unmistakably there, providing support and guidance during the critical phases of the rescue operation. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was as real as any physical sensation I'd ever experienced. The feeling reminded me of my own rescue 10 years earlier, when a mysterious diver had appeared from nowhere to save my life. But now I understood that the presence I'd felt wasn't supernatural. It was the accumulated experience and wisdom of everyone who had ever risked their life to save another diver. When we reached the surface and the rescued divers were safely aboard the Coast Guard cutter, I reflected on how my understanding of the ghost diver mystery had evolved over the past decade. The identity of my rescuer was less important than the tradition he represented, a commitment to diving safety that transcended individual recognition and operated through the collective actions of everyone who chose to help others in emergency situations. "Excellent work down there," Captain Santos told me as we headed back to port. "You probably saved 2 lives tonight." The commendation was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that I had successfully continued the mission that had saved my own life 10 years earlier. The debt I owed to my mysterious rescuer was being repaid through my actions on behalf of other divers who faced similar emergencies. Over the past decade, I had rescued 17 divers who had faced life-threatening emergencies in California waters. Each rescue had used techniques and procedures that traced back to David Mackenzie's innovations and the accumulated wisdom of decades of diving safety work. But more importantly, several of the divers I'd rescued had gone on to become rescue specialists themselves, continuing the cycle of life-saving expertise that had been operating for over 50 years. The ghost diver tradition isn't about one person, I explained to a group of diving instructors during a recent safety training seminar. It's about all of us taking responsibility for each other's safety and being prepared to risk our own lives to save fellow divers. The concept had been formalized into the California Technical Diving Rescue Network, a volunteer organization of experienced divers who were available to respond to diving emergencies throughout the state. The network included over 200 certified rescue specialists, many of whom had been motivated by their own rescue experiences to acquire advanced training. 15 years after my rescue, The mystery of the ghost diver had been transformed into a systematic approach to diving safety that protected thousands of divers throughout California waters. The individual who had saved my life remained unknown, but his legacy had grown into something far larger than any single person could have accomplished. I never got the chance to tell my rescuer what his intervention had meant to me during those critical moments when my equipment failed and death seemed certain. But I had spent 15 years trying to express that gratitude through my own actions, rescuing other divers and training the next generation of rescue specialists. The ghost diver had given me more than just my life. He had given me a mission that provided meaning and purpose beyond anything I could have achieved through normal career success. Every dive, every rescue, every training session was an opportunity to honor the debt I owed to someone whose name I would never know but whose influence would continue through every life I was able to save. Sometimes the most important gifts come from strangers who appear in our moments of greatest need and disappear before we can express our gratitude. But sometimes the best way to honor such gifts is to become the kind of person who appears in other people's moments of greatest need, continuing a tradition of selfless service that transcends individual recognition. The ghost diver had saved my life, but more importantly, he had shown me how to save others. That was a lesson worth a lifetime of gratitude and service.